I? Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the MOOCs live session 2 for this course, Environment and Development. Please tune in and put across your queries if there is. I'll be happy to respond and discuss. So, meanwhile, before going on to that, I'll try to give a quick recap of what we have done in the past few weeks, so that we have a sense of what we have uh, covered so far. Now, I'll try to go section by section on the thematic uh, points which we have covered. We have also looked into, religion and environment broadly by engaging upon the few religions concerning how to tackle the ongoing environmental crisis which we have encountered. We have engaged looking at some of the issues where uh, uh, based on the role of culture and spiritual heritage in context to the environmental protection vis-a-vis sustainable development, which have been for quite a long time ignored by the international bodies, the national governments, policy planners, and even, for that matter, the environmentalists. So there has been a lot of reluctance and uneasiness on the part of many of these bodies, and also an anxiety that bringing religion into the environmental movement will, to a large extent, dilute and threaten the objectivity, the scientific investigation, and also professionalism or the larger democratic values. So therefore, we could see that there's a lot of reluctance on the part of where religion has been seen to be something which is other when we talk about issues of environment. However, if one has to see historically, we could see that many religions or the religious teachings has been perceived to be something which act on the non-human nature, and in terms of particular human interest, beliefs, and social structures. So therefore, there has been the continuous evolutions or the kind of harmonious relationship which has been shared when we talk about religion and ecology in general. So this sort of categorizing or the binary which is being created is partly to do with the impact of Western scientific thinking, mostly which is derived from the the post scientific revolutions or the Enlightenment period. So in most of the Western monotheistic religions, there has been a general consensus that we should never forget that nature was God's creation and ultimately God's property and not our own. So, however, in other religious traditions, the distinctions between human and nature was not so distinct, and there's no boundary as such. So therefore, many of the indigenous traditions, for the most part, show that the natural world as peopled by beings with whom it was necessary to cultivate a mutually respectful relationship or a cordial or harmonious relationship uh, between all these components. So, and then later on, then with the advent of modernity, or perhaps much earlier, the indigenous traditions were, to a large extent, being marginalized by many of these modern states. So the questions arises that how has religion shaped our understanding of and our conduct towards nature? And how has the environmental crisis, challenged and transformed this modern theology and then the spiritual practices? And what have the world faiths believe about the human relations to nature? So, and how much beliefs and actions change as we face uh, the environment. So, from the perspective of many world religions, the abuse and exploitation of nature for our immediate gain is perceived to be unjust, immoral, and unethical. So, therefore, we will shortly try to engage looking at some of the indigenous or the Asian religions, which sort of tries to argue otherwise. Rather than the Western religions. So we have engaged upon looking at one of the important essays which is contributed by none other than Lynn White Jr., uh, which is titled as The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, where science was perceived to be traditionally aristocratic, speculative, and where uh, uh, Lynn White Jr. tries to argue that how Christian religion, which is being influenced by the Western scientific thinking, is to a large extent influencing the way human nature relationship is perceived. So, uh, what Lynn White Jr. also says is that uh, Christian religion is one of the most anthropocentric religions, and uh, which also, he has extensively blamed for the ecological crisis which we have encountered so far. And therefore, he also tries to, give a comparative uh, or compare between the medieval perceptions of nature, where human, to a large extent, has perceived that they are being part and parcel of nature. Now, going back to some of the world uh, religion like Buddhism, for instance, the nature of the biodiversity conservation ethics, which are mostly seen or heavily drawn from the Buddhist texts. Buddhism views humanity as an integral part of nature, so that when nature is defiled, people also in some way, there is a larger ramifications on the part that they ultimately serve. So many of the early Buddhist community have, by and large, lived closely uh, to nature, the trees, caves, and even in the mountainous areas. So therefore, they sort of maintained a kind of friendly attitudes toward their natural surroundings and oppose the destructions of forest or their wildlife. And one can go on to that, seeing that the first precept of Buddhism encapsulates the idea of do not kill. That is, this precept is not merely a legalistic prohibitions, but also a realization of our affinity with all who shares the give of life. So similarly, we can see that in the Hindu religion, that is pertaining to the nature conservation, that how in many of the Hindu religious literature, from the Vedas to the others, we can see in the oral texts, the Rig Veda, which also plays a prominent role in the later philosophical systems of how nature should not be defiled, and then how uh, nature should be taken care of, and for instance the sanctity of life. So this idea of divine being is perceived to one of the most underlying power of unity, which is expressed in none other than the text Ayurveda. So even according to the Atharva Veda, that the art is not for the human beings alone, but for other creatures as well. So therefore, it tries to bring in the notions of holistic approach in terms of also giving the other beings, the sentient beings, as one of the important agents or elements in these whole ecosystems. So further, we also delve upon trying to look at the doctrine of non-violence or ahimsa, where the Hindu religions of belief in a birth and rebirth, which talks about or provides solid foundations for the doctrine of ahimsa, that is non-violence against animals and human beings alone. So we have also delved upon the case study on the Misnoise communities who have drawn extensively their sense of environmental ethics from the Hindu religion by restraining themselves from harming or killing of animals, nor destructing of trees, which is perceived to be a blasphemy. So Lynn White earlier, as I had discussed, argues that the Christian worldview supports and encourages the exploitation of nature, unlike what the Asian religion has, namely Buddhism and Hinduism, has to talk about. So therefore, Lynn White, in his essay, tries to provide an unmistakable link between the rise of science through the influence of the Judeo-Christian tradition in the Middle Ages, even though the moral course was largely borne by Christianity and not science. So White argued that since the roots of trouble, that is the crisis which we are encountering, is largely religious in nature, therefore the remedy must also be essentially religious, whether we hold it to that or not. Now we move on to another sections on the natural resource management, which calls for the sustainable utilizations of the major natural resources such as land, water, minerals, forests, and broadly the flora and fauna. So since these resources to a large extent provided the ecosystem services for the betterment or to human life, it is judicious on our part to sustainably or judiciously use these resources. And therefore we have developed on certain concepts like the conservations of biodiversity. And why is it important to conserve the natural resources? As I have pointed out, that as we depends on the nature, or nature provides all the basic needs which are necessary to us, but we are on the other hand over exploiting and overusing these resources, and therefore if we go on over exploiting the nature, there will be no resources available for our future use. So therefore it is important, there is an urgent need to conserve the nature, and also the need for management of natural resources, owing to some of the increase in populations, industrializations, and urbanizations is also one important element which sort of tries to demand for more natural resources, and there's a need for a proper management of natural resources for that matter. Therefore, the proper management of natural resources would consist of the judicious use of natural resources and avoiding the wastage of natural resources, and a long-term planning in terms of the use of natural resources that it lasts only for the present, but also for the future generations, which is outlined by the Brennan report, where it tries to envisage what the sustainability or sustainable development talks about. So therefore, the exploitation of resources should not be for the benefit of a few people, but should be distributed equally. So in some sense, when we talk about the natural resource management, it also envisages the idea of justice or distributed justice. So therefore, we in some way, tries to locate or follow the formula of the three R's to save the environment, and then the three R's uh, categorically specifies the reduce, recycled, and reuse of the resources. And then we move on to looking at the themed on the common property versus the private property, and by locating these two within the debates of Garrett Hardin and Ostrom, we begin by looking at the tragedy of the commons that is published by the American ecologist Garrett Hardin. So the tragedy of the commons, to a large extent, explains the reason why growth stops or declines after a period of time, and because of the limited resources which are being shared among groups of individuals. And then tragedy of the commons also occurs primarily because the actors do not pay attention to the effects of their actions. Therefore, they continue their undesirable behavior until it is too late to undo or fix the resources. So therefore, it tries to envisaging or postulates the idea of private ownership of resources, and therefore, on opposite to this, Ostrom's come up with the idea of governing the commons. That is, although there is an open access, resource systems may collapse due to overuse, and such as in overfishing or overgrazing. Many examples have existed and then still do exist, where members of a community with regulated access to a common resource cooperate to exploit those resources prudently without collapse or even creating the perfect order. Ostrom's, in our book, Governing the Commons, which was published way back in 1990, included examples of how local communities were able to do this without the top-down regulations or privatization. So therefore, we have also, taken up, some of the themes such as livelihoods, forests, and conservations, where we are dependent on non-timber forest products for our livelihoods, and poverty alleviations and forest conservations. And we also look into the relationship between gender, forest, and livelihood, where the women folks basically in rural global south are dependent on these non-timber forest products, not simply for their consumption but also for market purposes. So I have also cited some sort of an examples for providing some case studies on forest and livelihoods in the case of Northeast India, and also how deforestation and its implications on women. So in the cases of where a larger development infrastructures or development activities like mining, dams, and all comes up, we could see a large, massive scales of deforestations, and which have a large ramifications on women in particular situations of where they have to really depend on their immediate environment, more importantly, for extracting non-timber forest products. So we have also looked into the issues of conservation and displacement, that is the conservation-induced displacement, where displacement is primarily a consequence of conservation projects, because conservations like development is inherently special. And then conservation, the growth rate of protected areas, which has been steadily witnessed in the past few decades, and then the by considering some of the protected areas as for the non-access of human. So therefore, we could see that there's cases of the use of force typically which are critical to the displacement. So the PS and that displacement has caused impoverishments and the political disempowerment. So we have also looked into the case study of the Van Guzers who belongs to the pastoralist community vis-a-vis the conservation-induced displacement, where the community, that is the Van Guzers, argue that their presence do not necessarily affect the biodiversity of the forest. On the contrary, they argue that it prevented the illegal activities like poaching and wood cutting by outsiders. So therefore, when one can conclude by saying that the notions of these guns and fences approach have undermined conservation itself by creating arenas. Next, we move on to the environment impact assessment and the national rehabilitations and resettlement policies by taking into certain kinds of procedures, the NRRP policies, wherein we try to envisage looking at the process of evaluating the likely environmental impacts of a proposed project or development by considering the interrelated socio-economic, cultural, and human health impacts. So we have also looked into acts such as the Dispossessions and Land Acquisition Act, which has been borrowed from the colonial law, which was brought into practice by the British government way back in the 1894. So this Land Acquisition Act of 1894 is a key to understanding the legal and institutional framework which is employed by the state in matters of land displacement and development. So we have also looked into the cases of mining development vis-a-vis the indigenous people, where the impact of mining can be massive. For instance, like land degradation, water and air pollution, marginalizations and food security, insecurity, social and cultural risk. So therefore, we could see that the impact of mining or those victims of development usually are the indigenous peoples. So therefore, the large-scale exploitations of resources, for instance, in the case of the states like Eastern India, predominantly like Jharkhand and Odisha, there has been a massive, mining which are being carried out for the past few decades. So we could see that this has adversely affected the indigenous peoples to a large extent, and they are also causes of their political economy, and their communities are broken up in the name of development for the national interest. So therefore, many scholars have argued that there's a new form of internal colonialism which are being unleashed on them by the ruling classes of the country. So we have also discussed the mining in the Ngamjahao Hills. That is how the Ngamjahao is very much sacred to the Dongriakwan community, not just in terms of providing resources, but also in terms of the socio-cultural and religious identity. So therefore, we could see that these are not a mere prevalence of forests or biodiversity, but also the abodes of the deities which are perceived to be sacred for many communities. So I've also delved upon trying to look at the debates of dams development and resistance by taking two case studies from the state of Manipur, that is the cases of the Tipaimuk Dam, where I looked at how the Barak River in some way is interrelated with the Mar identity, history, and culture, and why the objections are voiced against the Kipai Dam, and the flows in terms of the environmental impact assessment, where there is no prior and informed consent. So therefore, the general questioning of national development. And we move on to looking at the cases of the Mabitil Dam, that is based on the idea of this politics of land acquisitions, and how amidst militarizations these development projects are being carried out. So I've also partly tried to bring in the issues of the Narmada dams, where we try to look at the competing visions of development along the Narmada, that is the irony or the cases of the greater common good, by looking at the case of the Sardar Sarovar Dam. So the Sardar Sarovar Dam is a case of development project which is both directly and indirectly causing environmental displacement on a massive scale. So the livelihoods of many millions of the Adivasis have suffered because of the downstream effects of the dams, and the loss of fisheries, contaminations of water, and a decreased amount of water, and the farmlands, the agricultural lands are being affected. So these dams for the past few decades has been arguably one of the most controversial dam ever built in India. And it has been argued that modernizations adversely affects the forest communities because it devastates the traditional culture, identity, and destroys their habitats. So therefore, we try to give a critique to the notions of development in general, that is the charms of the very notions of sustainable development and social justice is being questioned from the activists which are taking different the Gandhian way of where they try to resist these forms of development. So therefore, the Sardar Sarovar project is just one more of too many projects said to be in the national interest, but when which in fact undermines the ability of the rural poor to control the use of the local resources. So I'll stop here, and I'll be happy to respond to any forms of queries or questions. You feel free to write to me, and we'll meet up again in the live session 3 in a few weeks.